This is a story about a monster named Johnny Bear. He really lived in Central California. I knew him. He caused a great deal of trouble before he was through. The village of Loma is built, as its name implies, on a low, round hill that rises like an island out of the flat mouth of the Salinas Valley in Central California. To the north and east of the town, a black tule swamp stretches for miles, but to the south, the marsh has been drained. Rich vegetable land has been the result of the draining, and the lettuce and cauliflowers grow to be giants. The owners of the swamp to the north of the village began to covet the black land. They banded together and formed a reclamation district. I worked for a company that took the contract to put a ditch through. The floating clamshell dredger arrived, was put together, and started eating a ditch of open water through the swamp. There aren't more than 200 people in Loma. The Methodist Church has the highest place on the hill, its spire is visible for miles. 2 groceries, a hardware store, an ancient Masonic hall, and the Buffalo Bar, and that's Loma. On the side of the hills are the small wooden houses of the population, and on the rich southern flats are the houses of the landowners, small yards usually enclosed by high walls of clipped cypress to keep out the driving afternoon winds. There was nothing to do in Loma in the evening except to go to the saloon, an old board building with swinging doors and a wooden sidewalk awning. Neither Prohibition nor Repeal had changed its business, its clientele, nor the quality of its whiskey. In the course of an evening, every male inhabitant of Loma, over 15 years old, came at least once to the Buffalo Bar, had a drink, and talked a while and went home. Fat Carl, the owner and bartender, greeted every newcomer with a phlegmatic sullenness which nevertheless inspired familiarity and affection. His face was sour, his tone downright unfriendly. And yet, I don't know how he did it. I know I felt gratified and warm when Fat Carl knew me well enough to turn his pig face to me and say with impatience, "What's it going to be?" He always asked that, although he served only whiskey and only one kind of whiskey. I've seen him flatly refuse to squeeze some lemon juice into it for a stranger. Fat Carl didn't like fumadiddles. He wore a big towel tied around his middle, and he polished the glasses on it as he moved about. The floor was bare wood, sprinkled with sawdust, the bar an old store counter, and the chairs hard and straight. The only decorations were the posters and cards and pictures stuck to the wall by candidates for county elections, salesmen and auctioneers. Some of these were many years old. The card of Sheriff Rittel still begged for re-election, although Rittel has been dead for 7 years. The Buffalo Bar sounds even to me like a terrible place. But when you walked down the night street over the wooden sidewalks, when the long streamers of swamp fog like waving dirty bunting slapped in your face, and when finally you pushed open the swinging doors of Fat Carl's and saw men sitting around talking and drinking, and Fat Carl coming along toward you, it seemed pretty nice. At least you couldn't get away from it. There'd be a game of the mildest kind of poker going on. Timothy Ratz would be playing solitaire, cheating pretty badly because he took a drink only when he got it out. I've seen him get it out 5 times in a row. When he won, he piled the cards neatly, stood up, and walked with great dignity to the bar. Fat Carl, with a glass half filled before he arrived, asked, "What'll it be?" "Whiskey," said Timothy gravely. In the long room, men from the farms and the town sat in the straight, hard chairs or stood against the wall counter. A soft, monotonous rattle of conversation went on, except at times of elections or prize fights, when there might be orations or loud opinions. Soon after my arrival in Loma, I scraped acquaintance with May Romero, a pretty half-Mexican girl. Sometimes in the evenings I walked with her down to the south of the hill until the nasty fog drove us back into town. After I escorted her home, I dropped in at the bar for a while. I was sitting in the bar one night talking to Alex Hartnell, who owned a nice little farm. We were talking about bass fishing when the front door opened and swung closed. A hush fell on the men in the room. Alex nudged me and said, "It's Johnny Bear." His name described him better than I can. He looked like a great, stupid, smiling bear. His black, matted head bobbed forward, and his long arms hung out as though he had been on all fours and was only standing upright as a trick. His legs were short and bowed and ended with strange, square feet. He was dressed in dark blue denim, but his feet were bare. They didn't seem to be crippled or deformed in any way, but they were just squares, wide as they were long. He stood in the doorway, swinging his arms, the way half-wits do. On his face was a foolish, happy smile. He moved forward. For all his bulk and clumsiness, he seemed to creep. He didn't move like a man, but like a bear. At the bar he stopped, and his little eyes went about from face to face, and he said, "Whiskey, whiskey for Johnny?" Loma was not a treating town. A man might buy a drink for another if he were pretty sure the other would immediately buy one for him. I was surprised when one of the quiet men slid a coin down the counter. Fat Carl filled a glass. The monster took it and gulped the whiskey. "What the devil?" I began, and Alex nudged me and said, "Shh." There began a curious pantomime. Johnny Bear moved to the door, and then he came creeping back. The smile never left his face. In the middle of the room, he crouched down on his stomach, and a voice came from his throat. The voice seemed familiar to me. "You are too beautiful to live in a dirty little town like this." The voice rose to a soft, throaty tone with just a trace of accent in the words. "You just tell me that." I nearly fainted. It was my own voice coming out of the throat of Johnny Bear. My own words, my own intonation. And then it was the voice of May Romero, exact. If I'd not seen the crouching man on the floor, I would have called to her. And the dialogue went on. These things sound silly when somebody else says them. Johnny Bear went right on, or rather, I should say, I went right on. And he said things and made sounds. Gradually, the faces of the men turned from Johnny Bear and turned toward me, and they grinned at me. And I couldn't do anything. I knew if I tried to stop him, I'd have a fight on my hands, so the scene went on to a finish. And when it was over, I was awfully glad May Romero had no brothers. I think the men in the bar were sorry for me. They looked away from me and talked elaborately to one another. Johnny Bear went to the back of the room, crawled under a round card table, curled up like a dog, and went to sleep. Alex Hartnell was regarding me with compassion. "First time you ever heard him?" "Yes, what in hell is he?" Alex ignored my question for a moment. "If you're worrying about May's reputation, don't. Johnny Bear's followed May before." "But how did he hear us? I didn't see him." "No one sees or hears Johnny Bear when he's on business. He can move like no movement at all. You know what our young men do when they go out with girls? They take a dog. Dogs are afraid of Johnny. They can smell him coming." "But good God, those voices." Alex said, "I know. Some of us rode up to the university about Johnny. Young man came down, took a look, and he told us about Blind Tom. Did you ever hear of Blind Tom?" "No, I haven't." "Well, Blind Tom was a Negro half-wit. He could hardly talk, but he could imitate anything he heard on the piano, long pieces. They tried him with musicians, and he reproduced not only the music, but every little personal emphasis. To catch him, they made little mistakes, and he played the mistakes. He photographed the playing in the tiniest detail. The man says Johnny Bear's the same, only he photographs words and voices. He tested Johnny with a passage in Greek, and Johnny did it exactly. He doesn't know the words he's saying, he just says them. He hasn't brains enough to make anything up, so you know what he says is true. Why does he do it? Why is he interested in listening if he doesn't understand?" "He isn't," said Alex. "He loves whiskey. He knows if he listens in windows and comes and repeats what he hears, somebody will give him whiskey." I said, "It's funny somebody hadn't shot him while he was peeking in the window." Alex picked up his cigarette. "Lots of people have tried, but they just don't see Johnny Bear. You can't catch him. You keep your windows closed, and even then you talk in a whisper if you don't want to be repeated. You were lucky it was dark tonight. If he'd seen you, he might have gone through the action." I looked at the sprawled figure under the table. The light fell on his black matted hair. I saw a big fly land on his head, and then I swear I saw the whole scalp shiver the way the skin of a horse shivers when a fly lands on it. The fly landed again, and the moving scalp shook it off again. Conversation in the room had settled to a bored monotone. Alex beside me said, "Have a drink." We walked to the counter, and Fat Carl put out 2 glasses. What'll it be? Carl's head twitched back toward the card table. "He got you, didn't he?" I winked at him. "I'll take a dog next time." Johnny Bear rolled over on his stomach. His face looked out at the room. And he came sliding out like an animal. "Whiskey? Whiskey?" It was like a bird call. "Whiskey?" The conversation in the room started, but nobody came forward with money. Johnny Bear smiled plaintively. "Whiskey?" And then he tried to cozen them. Out of his throat, an angry woman's voice issued. "I tell you, it was all bone, 20 cents a pound, and all bone." And then a man, "Yes, ma'am, I didn't know it. I'll give you some sausage to make it up." "Whiskey?" But none of the men offered to come forward. Johnny crept to the front of the room and crouched. I said, "What's he doing?" Alex said, "Shh." A woman's voice came, a cold, sure voice. The words clipped. I don't understand it. Are you some kind of monster? I wouldn't have believed if I hadn't seen you. And another woman's voice answered her, a voice low and hoarse. Maybe I am a monster. I can't help it. You must help it, the cold voice broke in. You'd be better dead. A soft sobbing came from the thick, smiling lips of Johnny Bear. All the men were stiff and listening. The sobbing stopped. Haven't you ever felt that way, Emmeline? The cold voice announced, certainly not. Never in the night, never ever in your life? If I had, said the cold voice, if I ever had, I'd cut that part of me away. Stop your whining, Amy. I won't stand it. Go to your prayers. Johnny Bear smiled on and said, whiskey? He smiled at the room, and then he went out with that creeping gait of his. Conversation didn't spring up again. Everyone in the room seemed to have a problem to settle in his own mind. One by one, they drifted out, and the backswing of the doors brought in little puffs of tule fog. Alex got up and walked out, and I followed him. The night was nasty with fog. It seemed to cling to the buildings, to reach out with free arms into the air. I doubled my pace and caught up with Alex. What is it? I demanded. What is all that about? For a moment I thought he wouldn't answer, but then he stopped and he turned to me. Oh, damn it, listen. Every town has its aristocrats. It's family above reproach. Emmeline and Amy Hawkins are our aristocrats. Their father was a congressman. I don't know why Johnny does this. They feed him. We shouldn't give him whiskey. I asked, are they relatives of yours? No, but they aren't like other people. They have the farm next to mine. 2 maiden ladies, some Chinese farm it on shares. Why, the Hawkins women, they're symbols. They're what we tell our kids when we want to describe good people. Well, I protested. Nothing Johnny Bear said would hurt them, would it? I don't know. I'm going to bed, he said. About 8 the next morning, I walked down across the swamp to the dredger. The crew was busy bending some new wire to the drums and coiling the worn cable for removal. I looked over the job and at 11 o'clock walked back to Loma. In front of Mrs. Ratt's boarding house, Alex Hartnell sat in a Model T Ford touring car. He called to me. I was just going out to the dredger to get you. I knocked off a couple of chickens this morning. Thought you might like to come and help with them. I accepted joyfully. As we drove along the road, Alex shouted, remember about the Hawkinses? Of course I remember. He pointed ahead. That's their house. Little of the house could be seen, for a high, thick hedge of cypress surrounded it. It must be a small garden inside the square, too. Only the roof and the tops of the windows showed over the hedge. I could see the house was painted tan, trimmed with dark brown, a combination favored for railroad stations and schools in California. There were 2 wicket gates in front and side of the hedge. The hedge was clipped square, and it looked strong and thick. It keeps the wind out, Alex shouted. Doesn't keep Johnny Bear out, I said. He waved at a whitewashed square building standing out in the field. That's where the Chink sharecroppers live. At that moment, from behind the corner of the hedge, a horse and buggy turned into the road. The gray horse was old but well-groomed, and the buggy shiny and the harness polished. There was a big silver H on the outside of each blinder. It seemed to me that the check rein was too short for such an old horse. Alex said, there they are now on their way to church. We took off our hats and bowed to the women as they went by, and they nodded formally to us. I had a good look at them. They looked almost exactly as I thought they would. Johnny Bear was more monstrous than I had known, if by the tone of voice he could describe the features of people. I didn't have to ask which was Emmeline, which was Amy. The clear, straight eyes, the sharp chin, the mouth cut with the precision of a diamond, the stiff, curveless figure, that was Emmeline. Amy was very like her, but unlike. Her edges were soft, her eyes were warm, and her mouth full, and there was a swell to her breast, and yet she did look like Emmeline. But whereas Emmeline's mouth was straight by nature, Amy held her mouth straight. Emmeline must have been 50 or 55, and Amy maybe 10 years younger. I had only a moment to look at them, and I never saw them again. A place like Loma, with its fogs, with its great swamp, like a hideous sin, really needed the Hawkins women. I could see that. It was a good dinner at Alex's. His sister fried the chicken and butter and did everything else right. And we sat around in the dining room and drank really good brandy. I said, I don't see why we ever go to the Buffalo? That whiskey is... I know it is, said Alex, but the Buffalo is the mind of Loma. It's a newspaper. It's our club. This was so true that when Alex started the Ford and prepared to take me back, I knew and he knew that we would go for an hour or two to the Buffalo Bar. We were nearly into town. The feeble lights of the car splashed about on the road. Another car rattled toward us, and Alex swung across the road and stopped. It's Dr. Holmes, he explained. The oncoming car pulled up because it couldn't get around us. Alex called, "Say, Doc, I was going to ask you to take a look at my sister. She's got a swelling on her throat." Dr. Holmes called back, "All right, Alex, I'll take a look, but pull out, will you? I'm in a hurry." Alex was deliberate. "Who's sick, Doc?" "Why, Miss Amy had a little spell. Get out of the way, will you?" We drove on. I was about to remark that the night was clear when, looking ahead, I saw rags of fog creeping around the hill from the swamp side and climbing like slow snakes on top of Loma. The Ford shuddered to a stop in front of the Buffalo, and we went in. Fat Carl moved toward us, wiping a glass, and he reached under the bar for the nearby bottle. "What'll it be?" he asked. "Whiskey." For a moment a smile seemed to flit on his sullen, fat face. The room was full. My dredger crew was there, even. But it was the quietest bar I ever saw. Somehow the sullen, baleful eyes of Fat Carl made drinking a quiet, efficient business. Timothy Ratz was playing solitaire at one of the round tables. The doors unfolded silently, and Johnny Bear crept in. His square feet were like cat's feet. "Whiskey," he chirped, and no one encouraged him. He went down on his stomach the way he had got me, and sing-song nasal words came out. Chinese, I thought. And then it seemed to me that the same words were repeated in another voice, slower, not nasally. Johnny Bear raised his shaggy head and he asked, "Whiskey?" I slid a quarter along the bar and Johnny gulped his drink. And the chill voice of Emmeline said, "She's in here, Doctor." "You said a fainting fit." "Yes, Doctor." There was a little pause, and then the doctor's voice, very softly, "Why did she do it, Emmeline?" "Why did she do what?" "I'm your doctor, Emmeline. I was your father's doctor. Don't you think I've seen that kind of mark before? How long was she hanging?" There was a longer pause then, and the chill left the woman's voice. 2 or 3 minutes. "Will she be all right?" "Oh, yes, she'll come around." "Why did she do it?" The answering voice was even colder than it had been at first. "I don't know, sir." "You mean you won't tell me?" "I mean what I say." Then the doctor's voice went on, giving directions for treatment, rest, milk, and a little whiskey. "Above all, be gentle," he said. "Be gentle with her." Emmeline's voice trembled a little. "You would never tell, Doctor?" "Of course I won't tell. I'll send you some sedatives." Whiskey, and my eyes jerked open, and there was the horrible Johnny Bear smiling around the room. The next morning, one of those series of accidents so common in construction landed on us. One of the new wires parted on the in-swing and dropped the bucket on one of the pontoons, sinking it and the works in 8 feet of ditch water. When we dropped a dead man and got a line out to it to pull us from the water, the line parted and clipped the legs neatly off one of the deckhands. We bound the stumps and rushed him to Salinas. My contact with the social life of Loma went to pot for a while, but when the bucket was banging in the mud again and the big diesel was chuttering away in the swamp, I walked up to Alex Hartnell's farm one night. Passing the Hawkins place, I peered in through one of the little wicket gates in the cypress hedge. The house was dark, more dark, because a low light glowed in one window. There was a gentle wind that night, blowing balls of fog like tumbleweeds along the ground. I walked in the clear a moment, and then was swallowed in the mist. And then it was clear again. In the starlight, I could see the silver fog balls moving like elementals across the fields. When I came suddenly out of the fog, I saw a dark figure hurrying along in the field, and I knew from the dragging footsteps it must be one of the Chinese field hands, walking in sandals. Alex seemed glad to see me. His sister was away. I sat down at his stove, and he brought out a bottle of that nice brandy. "I heard you were having some trouble," he said. "Yeah, the men have got it figured out. Accidents come in groups of 3, 5, 7, and 9. Alex nodded. "I feel that way myself." "How are the Hawkins sisters?" I asked. He didn't want to talk about them, and at the same time he wanted to talk about them. "I stepped over about a week ago. Miss Amy isn't feeling very well. I didn't see her. I only saw Miss Emmeline." You almost seem to be related to them, I said. Well, their father and my father were friends. We called the girls Aunt Amy and Aunt Emmeline. They can't do anything bad. It wouldn't be good for any of us if the Hawkins sisters weren't the Hawkins sisters. The community conscience, I asked. The safe thing, he said. The place where a kid can get gingerbread. They believe in the things we hope are true, and they live as though honesty really is the best policy and charity really is its own reward. And he said, Miss Emmeline is fighting something, and I don't think she's going to win. What do you mean? I don't know what I mean. Oh, I should shoot Johnny Bear and throw him in the swamp. It's not his fault. I walked back to Loma. It seemed to me that the fog was clinging to the cypress hedge of the Hawkins house, and it seemed to me also that a lot of the fog balls were clustered about it, and others were moving slowly in. In the evening of the second day after my visit to Alex, I walked down the wooden sidewalk, trailing a streamer of fog behind me, and went into the Buffalo Bar. Fat Carl came toward me, and I cried whiskey before he had a chance to ask what it would be. I took my glass and went to one of the straight chairs. Alex was not there. At about 10 o'clock, the news came. Miss Amy had committed suicide. She'd hanged herself. The swinging doors opened slowly, and there was Johnny Bear creeping in, and he said, "Whiskey, whiskey for Johnny." Fat Carl poured him a drink quickly, and Johnny Bear gulped it. The doctor's tone was harsh. "Where is she, Emmeline?" I've never heard a voice like the one that answered. Cold control, layer and layer of control. "She's in here, doctor." A long pause. "She was hanging quite a while." "I don't know how long, doctor." "Why did she do it, Emmeline?" The monotone again. "I don't know, doctor." A longer pause, and then, "Emmeline, did you know she was going to have a baby?" "Yes, doctor." "Is that why you didn't find her for so long?" "No, Emmeline, I didn't mean that. I didn't mean that." "Can you make out a certificate without mentioning it?" "Of course I can. I'll speak to the undertaker. Do." "Thank you, doctor." "And whiskey for Johnny, whiskey." Fat Carl poured another glass, and Johnny Bear drank it, and then crept to the back of the room and crawled under the table and went to sleep. No one spoke. The men moved up to the bar and laid down their coins silently. They looked bewildered, for a system had fallen. A few minutes later, Alex came into the silent room, and he walked quickly over to me. "You've heard?" he said softly. "Yes." I said, "Did you know she was pregnant?" Alex stiffened. He looked around the room and then back at me. "Johnny Bear?" he asked. I nodded. Alex ran his palm over his eyes. "I don't believe it." I was about to answer when I heard a little scuffle and looked to the back of the room and saw Johnny Bear crawl like a badger out of his hole. He came to the bar. "Whiskey," he said, and he smiled expectantly at Fat Carl. Then Alex stepped out, and he said, "Now you guys listen. I've had enough of this. I don't want any more of it." "Whiskey for Johnny?" Alex turned on the idiot. "You ought to be ashamed. Miss Amy gave you food. She gave you all the clothes you ever had." And Johnny smiled at him and said, "Whiskey?" He got out his tricks, and I heard again the sing-song nasal language that sounded like Chinese. Alex looked relieved, and then the other voice, slow, hesitant, repeating the words, but without the nasal quality. Alex moved so quickly I didn't see him move. He splashed his fist into Johnny Bear's smiling mouth. Johnny Bear recovered his balance. His lips were split, but the smile was still there. His arms enfolded Alex as the tentacles of an anemone enfold a crab. Alex bent backward. I jumped in and grabbed one of the arms and wrenched at it, but couldn't tear it loose, and Fat Carl came rolling over the counter with a bung starter in his hand. He beat the matted head until the arms relaxed, and Johnny Bear crumpled. I helped Alex to a chair, and I asked, "Are you hurt?" He tried to get his breath. "My back's wrenched, I guess," he said. "I'll drive you home." Neither of us looked at the Hawkins place as we went by. I got Alex to his own dark house and helped him to bed and poured a hot brandy into him. He hadn't spoken all the way home. But after he was propped in bed, he said, "You don't think anyone noticed, do you? I caught him in time, didn't I?" "What are you talking about? Why'd you hit him?" "Well, listen," he said, "I'll have to stay close for a little while with this back. But if you hear anyone say anything, stop it. Don't let it go. Don't let them say it." "I don't know what you're talking about." He looked at me for a long moment, and he said, Well, you know that second voice? That was Miss Amy.